on to Workshop 8. In this module, which in the manual is on page 25, starts on page 25, we're going to talk specifically about the Yosemite tour, some of the details of that tour, and also go through some guidelines for the buses and procedures, etc. So I've got a few things to cover. Let's get started. Let's talk a little bit about the Yosemite tour and our policy with regards to the Tuolumne Grove of giant sequoias. So the Yosemite tour has always been and remains one of our, actually our best-selling tour. One of the attractions of that tour is the hike to see the giant sequoia trees at the Tuolumne Grove. This hike is not available year-round. Every year, at different times depending on the weather. In warmer, drier years, things are different than in colder, wetter years. But every year there's going to be a time in the off-season where access to the giant sequoia trees at Tuolumne Grove is shut down. We choose to shut it down because of the safety of the trail itself. When it snows up in the mountains, that makes the trail very unsafe. With ice, it gets very slippery. It's quite a steep trail, as you will find out. And so, for the safety of our passengers, we stop doing that hike. And generally, the weather in the mountains is pretty erratic in winter. It can quickly change, and on top of that, the route that we take most of the year, Highway 120, which takes us through Oakdale and then up through the Big Oak Flat entrance to Yosemite, will often get shut down in wintertime. Depends on the year, but most years it does get shut down once the snow begins to fall. And so we shift to our winter route at that point along Highway 140, going through Merced and then up from the southwest, coming in along the Merced River, which comes into the valley at a lower elevation, and therefore that's the road that's open and available year-round. Highway 120 isn't always open year-round. In fact, typically it's not. So every year there will come a time in late fall, could even happen in mid-fall, or early winter, anywhere from October into November, December. Typically it's when we get the first significant snow, and that's the point at which we may have to stop allowing or stop including the hike to the giant sequoias on our Yosemite tour. When we do that, we still spend the same amount of time in the park, 5 hours, but we spend more time in the valley and give our passengers more free time. So we may make an extra stop or two down in the valley, and then we extend the lunch break to a longer break to try to make up for the fact that we didn't do the giant sequoia hike. This policy that we have is, again, for the safety of our passengers. When the road is shut down, when Highway 120 is shut down, then that becomes the National Park's decision, and we really have no control over that. But there are often times where the road will still be available, but we've chosen not to include the hike. This can be sometimes challenging. There are passengers who really wanted to see the giant sequoias. We do have messages on all our marketing materials that the hike is weather dependent, and so there is information out there that lets people know that we might have to cancel the hike depending on weather. However, passengers don't always see that, and so you will from time to time get people who are not happy about having that hike canceled, and so your ability to communicate that in a positive way and manage people's expectations and let them know that you're going to make up for the fact that we're not doing the hike in other ways is important. One thing we want to make clear to all of our expedition leaders is to not become overly apologetic about the fact that we had to cancel the hike. It's really for the safety of our passengers. It's weather-based, and it's not a decision that we take lightly. nor is it a decision that you as an expedition leader are going to make on your own. We, the management and the owner, make the decision. And once that decision has been made, we expect our guides, our expedition leaders, to respect the decision. So that's not your decision, whether you're going to the trees or not. It is the decision of the management staff. And if we find out that an expedition leader chose to go do the hike to the giant sequoias without approval, that is a serious issue and could be grounds for termination or dismissal. So keep that in mind. There is also a time period, usually in spring and fall, as the weather is changing, where, and even in dry years through the winter, where some days we might be going to the giant sequoias, the hike, and some days we might not. And we'll get into that a little bit more in one of the next slides. But so please always respect the decision of the manager on duty. They are the ones who are making the decision about doing the hike. All right, we are on to section 1-10 in the manual, page 27, driving and the Yosemite tour route. Before I get into what is actually on this slide, something I wanted to mention. And I think we've talked about this already in this presentation, but we have two routes that we use to enter Yosemite National Park, depending on the time of the year and the weather. The primary route that we like to use is along Highway 120, which enters Yosemite National Park from the northwest at the Big Oak Flat entrance. That's our preferred route because it's the shortest. And on that route, that takes us through the town of Oakdale for our midway stop. The alternate route is Highway 140, which comes in from the southwest, and that's our winter route, and that's accessed off of Highway 99 from the town of Merced. And so that's important because we, at a certain point in the year, kind of, in most cases, coinciding with the shift in weather that causes the end of the giant sequoia hike, which we were just talking about, we often shift to the winter route along Highway 140. And again, like with the giant sequoia hike, there's a seasonal element to that where at a certain point in most years, typical years, Highway 120 just gets shut down by the National Park Service. It gets closed, or not even just the National Park Service, the CHP, and we can no longer use it. Sometimes it's not actually closed, but it has restrictions on it that require application of chains, and in order to avoid that, we choose the Highway 140 route to minimize our need for chains. So most years, except in an unusually dry year, there will be a point in the year, often in October, November, maybe December, where we switch to using the Highway 140 route. That route enters Yosemite National Park at a lower elevation along the Merced River, and so it's less necessary to use chains, although often you still need to, but you can put them on a lot later and it doesn't slow you down as much. And again, in the late fall and early spring, as weather's changing, we can be going back and forth between Highway 120 and Highway 140. And again, we're going to talk a little bit more about that process in the next slide. Just note that what will happen often is when we hire people in our primary recruiting season, which is springtime, around March, oftentimes people are hired and trained on the Highway 140 route and have perhaps never seen the primary route, the Highway 120 route. Or alternatively, sometimes people are hired in the summer, or when we've shifted back to the Highway 120 summer route, and have never been trained in the winter route. And so where we will try to make sure that we address that and train you on both routes, keep that in mind in case you haven't been trained, to prompt us to make sure that you know the alternate. So that's just something to keep in the back of your mind. If you, when you were hired and trained, if you learned one route, know that there is this other route that you'll need to learn, and prompt us if we don't prompt you to make sure you know that route. So onward with this slide. It's your responsibility when driving to Yosemite, particularly in the wintertime, to know how to install chains on both the vans and the buses. We have a really good video starring our very own Kurt that will show you in a lot of detail how to put chains on both the vans and the buses. It's slightly different for each, and so we will have you watch that video. And if at that point you still feel, if you've never put chains on vehicles like this and you want an actual in-person demonstration, we will also schedule to have someone actually show you how to do it and have you do it, because it's nice to actually do it once before you get up there and have to do it under extreme weather conditions, cold. So we have procedures in place to train you how to do this, and it'll be your responsibility to know and be prepared to do it, because pretty much every winter there's going to be a time where you're going to have to put chains on the vehicles. It's not a lot of fun, but if you know what you're doing, it's not so bad. We keep chains in the vehicles, and in part that's because it's the law. Under conditions where you're required to carry chains, we absolutely have to have chains in our vehicles, even if you don't need them in the end. We do our best to have a workable set of chains in every vehicle, and we like to have a spare as well. We do our best to have a spare as a backup. Part of your pre-trip inspection, when you know that we're in the time of year where you might need chains, is to double check that they're there. Know that you have the chains you need. So part of the onus is on you to inspect and make sure you've got your chains. Also, check on the road, park, and weather conditions before you're going up to Yosemite. What I usually like to do the night before my Yosemite tour, I will call the Yosemite hotline, which the phone number is listed here on the slide. You'll want to program that into your telephone, area code 209-372-0200, and then it'll prompt you, and you can select to listen to either the road conditions or the weather conditions. I usually listen to both. That'll give you a heads up on what the situation is. Typically you should know that the reservations office will have hopefully informed you of which route we are currently using to get into the park. But that will also, checking the hotline will also give you a sense for the current weather conditions and the current road conditions. The way the Park Service breaks down road conditions, they have the different status. R0 basically means the road's open, no restrictions, so you can take whatever road is R0 regardless. You don't need to be carrying chains. R1 or R2 means chains are required. So, and then R3 or R4 means the road is closed to us. So you'll want to get to know those statuses, and essentially once Highway 120 shifts to R1, that's generally our indicator that we're going to shift to the Highway 140 winter route rather than Highway 120. So R0, no restrictions. R1 and R2, you'll need chains. R3 and R4, road is closed. So get that hotline in your phone. Another thing I like to do in the morning as I'm driving up to Yosemite, just before I get to Highway 99, I like to call the hotline again and check the weather conditions, because they often update they often update both road conditions and weather conditions around 7:30 to 8 o'clock in the morning. And so whatever they had on the recording the night before may be updated. And so you may get some different information. And that allows me, beyond everything else, knowing the situation, I can actually give my passengers a quick weather report, let them know what's to be expected. So I like to check the hotline a second time on the morning as I'm driving, just before I get to Highway 99. The reason for that timing is that should the road conditions have changed last minute, and perhaps I was under the assumption that I'd be taking Highway 120 because it was R0 and it was open, but then let's say they had a last minute snowstorm and they've closed it off that morning. You can catch that early and you can change your plans and take the Highway 140 route. Go south on Highway 99 instead of north. So that's why I like to do that. And then finally, just be prepared to put chains on if the park rangers or CHP require it. They generally have designated areas set up for you to put your chains on. Um, so be ready to do that, because there will be a point where you do need to do that. Keep. All right, just before I get into this slide, a couple things I left out on the last slide. One, just quickly, you'll see it in the actual manual, but I forgot to mention it. There's a website in addition to the telephone number for the Yosemite hotline. There's a website you can go to, www.wonderground.com. You'll see it in the manual, and that allows you to check online for weather status. You can have that in your smartphone or on your computer. And that's another way to check the status of weather, and you can use that for really anywhere. It's pretty cool. Another thing, the company will reimburse you a one-time fee, or will reimburse you once up to $75 if you want to purchase clothing to assist you, appropriate clothing for putting on chains in cold weather, rain pants and a raincoat, that sort of thing. So that's something we offer, a reimbursement of up to $75 so that you have the appropriate clothes when you're changing tires. So moving on, we are on to, this is just where we're going to get into a little bit more detail about how we establish which route we're using to get into the park, as I've already talked about a couple times. So I've already kind of gone over some of this. So our three status that we have for the route into the Yosemite National Park are green flag, or sequoia status, red flag status, and yellow flag status. And this is always true. Just remember this. Always drive safely, but especially during winter conditions. Obviously, safety, as I've already mentioned, is our number one concern. Always, always, always. It's our first priority, our second priority, our third priority. Driving safe always has to be your first order of business. Winter conditions obviously create new challenges for drivers, and so you need to put yourself on a higher level of sort of safety orientation when you're driving up in the mountains. Weather can change very quickly. You can hit ice, and so just keep that in mind, and remember, always put safety first. No matter where you are on your schedule, if you feel like you're behind schedule, don't let your desire to get home early or on time or whatever, don't let that allow you to subject your passengers to unsafe conditions. Those passengers are relying on you to drive safely, drive professionally, and get them home safe and sound. So in terms of our status, the green flag status or sequoia status, that's how we designate that we are taking Highway 120 and we're including the giant sequoia hike on our tour. And that's usually much of the year, typically from May to October, although that fluctuates a lot. Red flag status means we are definitely not doing the giant sequoia hike, and we are going to be typically taking Highway 140. Yellow flag status means it's a day-by-day decision that the manager on duty is making, and the reservations office will let you know. So those are the status. There's a little bit more detail on that in the manual on page 28. All right, we are on to page 29, section 1-11 in the manual, astronomical driver dress code. We do have a driver dress code, which is not overly rigid. We want you guys to be comfortable out on the road and dressed appropriately. We do believe, though, that your personal appearance is in part what projects a professional image for our company and for you as a driver. And so we have some basic expectations, which I'll just kind of go through. They're pretty much laid out here. But we feel that neatly dressed and groomed expedition leaders, that's what passengers will respond well to. And so that's our expectation. Specifically, collared shirts, or neat tour-appropriate t-shirts. So t-shirts are okay, just no inappropriate or offensive logos or messages on those shirts. Pants that are neat and clean with no holes and or tatters worn at the waist. Shorts or skirts can be worn if they're neat, without holes or tatters, and are professional, not too short. Shoes that are professional, comfortable, and safe for driving, and appropriate for the tour you're doing. And then hats can be worn that are clean and professional. Again, no inappropriate or offensive logos. So as you can see, one of the keys here is that your passengers feel that you look like a professional, and that nothing that you're wearing would elicit any sort of negative response from your passengers. That's the key thing here. And that's, in a nutshell, that's our driver's dress code. Thanks. All right. Still on page 29, section 1-12, bus guidelines and procedures. Some extra details about driving the buses. We should have already talked about this, but we do have a bus passenger bonus, or what we call a completion bonus. Completion bonuses are paid on all tours, assuming that a certain set of criteria were met for that tour. So each tour that you conduct and lead and complete will be considered either successful completion or not, dependent largely on whether or not you followed astronomical procedures and policies, you didn't leave any passengers behind, you conducted a safe tour. So pretty straightforward what the criteria is. Assuming you successfully complete your tour, which should be most days, you will receive your completion bonus, structured a little bit differently in the vans and in the buses. We should have already talked about this in your interview process, but specifically for the vans, it's a straight percentage of your day rate. If you have a question about that, feel free to ask the operations manager. In the bus, what we do is, and again, we should have already talked about this, but for every passenger that you carry on a round-trip tour, over 13, which is the number of people you would have had if you would have driven a full van, you will receive, for every person you transport over the number 13 on a Yosemite tour, you're going to receive $5 per person over the number 13 for every round-trip passenger. On a Muir Woods and Wine Country tour in a bus, that number is $3 per person for a round trip. And it's not in the manual actually, but our city tours are now often going in a bus, and so on a city tour it's $2 per person over the number 13. That's your bonus structure. And again, I've already said this, but bus passenger bonuses and completion bonuses generally can be revoked if you break astronomical policies or procedures, if you leave passengers behind, if you do anything that violates the criteria that you need to meet to successfully complete your tour. Also, extra care must be taken in parking or leaving a parking space, and at gas stations especially. That's when we tend to have the majority of our problems and collisions in buses. There's just added risk when you're pulling into or out of a parking space, and in gas stations. Going in reverse in those buses is often your blind spots kind of handicap you, and so do everything very slowly. Just add that extra level of caution, and remember always the rear end of the bus, the dragon tail. That tends to get a lot of drivers we've already talked about this, but just remember that when you're turning those buses, the rear of the bus, because the rear wheel is so far forward of the actual back end of the bus, the rear of the bus swings out. And so if you're making a left tour, the rear of the bus is going to swing out to the right, and vice versa. That becomes particularly an issue when you're pulling out of parking spaces. If you're too close to the curb, as you pull out, you might hit a limb of a tree up above the back of the bus if it's jutting out, or even the rear end of the bus swings out over the top of the curb, and there might be a fire hydrant or a parking meter or something. So we've had a lot of incidences with the tail, the dragon tail. Also on hills, we've already talked about this. On steep hills, you just need to avoid them, because as you get to the flat part of an intersection, you can drag the back of the bus. So always just be super cautious, but especially when entering and leaving parking spaces, gas stations, etc. And then there are a few tours that you need to alter your route a bit when you're in a bus versus a van. Specifically on the Yosemite tour, um, there's some places you can park in a van, but you can't park in a bus. And again, I think we talked about this, but we, the when we train you on the Yosemite tour, the stops we are training you on are the stops that we are making. We ask that you not make stops outside of that because the Park Service is pretty clear on where we are and aren't allowed to park in the buses. And even in the vans, there's a little bit more leeway with the vans. For instance, we are not allowed to go into the Bridal Veil parking lot in a bus, but we are allowed to in a van. So we need to be very careful and stick to the stops that we have approved, particularly if you're in a bus, because if you don't do that, the rangers could cite you and could pull our permit for use in the parking. As we've already talked about, that's severe. So protect yourself, protect the company, and pay attention to where you can and can't go. Another thing, going up to Yosemite, that steep section that takes you from the foothills right up to the towns of Big Oak Flat and Groveland, the Priest grade, very steep. We recently found out that the CHP requires that all commercial vehicles, whether it's going up or down, require that we take the new Priest grade, which is the longer route. The steep old Priest grade is really is reserved for passenger cars. And so going up and going down, you need to take the new Priest grade, even though it takes a little bit longer. And that's the safer route on the way up so that you don't overheat, and on the way down so that you're not overdoing it on your brakes. And again, I think this is something else we've talked about, but it was worth repeating. Coming out of Yosemite, coming down long grades anytime, use your engine braking. There's various forms of engine braking. There's you can downshift. There's also the overdrive, and in some of the buses you've got the exhaust braking. Learn to use those. We can train you on how to use those appropriately. When we are training you on the Yosemite tour, we should talk about using engine braking because that's our preferred way to control speed coming out of these long downhill grades, especially that return from Yosemite. If you use your service brakes too much, they overheat. That can put you in a dangerous situation, and it also just wears out the brakes, gets down to the rotors more quickly, and so we want to make sure that you understand the appropriate use of engine braking and do so.